So the Poco M4 Pro 5G just arrived on the scene, and it is a very late but very sizzling hot contender for the best budget smartphone of 2021 crown. And to show just how ruddy good it really is, I thought I'd put the Poco M4 Pro up against two of my other favourite budget smartphones of 2021, namely the Xiaomi Redmi Note 10S and the Realme 8 5G. This is my full side-by-side comparison to see how these budget blowers stack up for the camera tech, gaming chops, battery life, all that good stuff. And for more on the latest and greatest tech, please do subscribe and ding that notifications bell. Cheers! So here is the illustrious lineup. Got the Poco M4 Pro 5G here on the left, Realme 8 5G here on the right, and then the fill-in for this delicious budget smartphone sandwich is the Xiaomi Redmi Note 10S. It's the only one of the bunch not to sport a very, very yellow box. Of course, far from the only difference between these three, view them all from the front, a fairly similar sort of design, fairly chunky bezels surrounding those displays, though you do have a central selfie orifice on the Poco and the Xiaomi smartphone, whereas the Realme wedges it away in the corner, which I actually prefer, even if that orifice is rather gaping, so to speak. The Poco is actually the biggest of the trio at 6.6 inches, although the 6.5 inch Realme is pretty much the same in terms of dimensions because it's got slightly thicker bezels surrounding that display. Meanwhile, the Redmi in the middle, the 6.4 incher, is the smallest, but not exactly by a huge amount. I mean, no matter your choice, you're gonna want to use it two-handed, because yeah. The Poco and the Redmi smartphones actually have a Gorilla Glass 3 display, whereas there's no mention of Gorilla Glass whatsoever in Realme's official specs for the 8 5G. That said, the Realme 8 5G does at least have a pre-installed screen protector on it, as does the Poco M4 Pro 5G, but none of that on the Redmi Note 10S. So let's just flip these budget morphos about. And all three of these budget handsets have a plastic back, but as you can see there, they sport a very different design. The Redmi and the Realme smartphones are actually probably the closest. They've got quite a glossy back end, which does tend to pick up greasy prints rather easily. Meanwhile, Poco has gone for a very different matte plastic finish that tends to hide the greasy marks a little bit more easily. But then you also have this whopping huge bit of branding on the Poco M4 Pro compared with the relatively subtle efforts here on the Redmi and the Realme. Gotta say though, I've personally found that of this trio, the Poco M4 Pro is the hardiest. I've chucked all three in my backpack, I've generally treated them like crap, and this one so far is still in pristine condition, whereas you've got a few tiny little scratches here and there on the Redmi and the Realme. As for the exciting topic of F ratings, well, both the Poco and the Redmi are IP53 splash resistant, so good news if, you like your drink, you're in the habit of accidentally knocking your shandy over occasionally. If the Poco or the Redmi get a soaking, no worries, they're probably going to be absolutely fine, whereas in the case of the Realme, no official IP ratings, you've got to be really careful around moisture. And good news if you've got more than one SIM card as well, because you've got dual SIM support on all three of these budget handsets. Now let's move on from design to software, and all three of these smartphones rock a bit of Android 11, but on the Poco and the Redmi you've got Xiaomi's MIUI 12 launcher slathered on top, and here in the case of the Realme 8 5G it's the Realme UI launcher instead. Now the overall vibe with both of these launchers now is a fairly stock Android experience thankfully, so you've got an apps tray. If you flick up, nice and easy to store away all your bits. If you flick like so, you've got the Google Discover feed, all of your latest headlines. One of the main UI advantages of MIUI, something I really like, is the control center, which you can drag down from the right hand side of your desktops like so. This gives you fast access to a whole bunch of toggles, including, yes, all of your smart home goodies. And you don't get that in the Realme UI, that is a MIUI exclusive, so you just drag down your notifications bar as usual, and then there's your toggles. And while we're in here, you can see all three smartphones sport the usual features you would expect even on budget-friendly blowers, the likes of NFC, present and correct on all three. You actually dive on into the settings, you'll see you get all of the standard Android features packed onto all three of these blowers as well, but you also get some bonus bits in MIUI and Realme UI. These include various gesture controls, and yes, you do get a bit of one-handed help on all three as well. You've also got a dedicated gaming mode on all three of these blowers as well. Great news if you are a gamer, and we'll be touching more on gaming in a bit. And all three of these smartphones rock a edge-mounted fingerprint sensor built into that power button. Just a quick tap of your digit against that and you are straight in there. All super fast, super responsive. Certainly had absolutely no problems whatsoever with any of these blowers as far as that sensor goes. And all three of these budget smartphones also support face unlock as well, which is just as nippy as the fingerprint sensor, but I wouldn't entirely depend on it to be the most secure method of unlocking your smartphone. For one, on all three, the face unlock works even when you're wearing a face mask, unlike rivals from like Samsung and Apple. So yeah, in terms of the security, I'd maybe just stick with a fingerprint sensor. Unfortunately, one of the bad bits about grabbing Poco, Xiaomi or Realme smartphones is the sheer amount of crapware that you get bundled on these things. I mean, these things are practically filled to the brim. It seems especially worse on Poco and Redmi smartphones. You get all kinds of just crappy games bundled on here, the likes of Tile Fun. You've got Xiaomi's own browsers and other first-party apps. In the case of the Poco phone, you've got the links to the Poco store and the Poco community, Amazon, Shares, LinkedIn, TikTok, all of that crud. And the Realme smartphone certainly ain't any better. You've got stuff like Oh Roman crammed on there, once again, TikTok, a whole bunch of stuff I'm not even sure what it is, like 92. Thankfully, you can just delete a lot of this crapware straight off. And in terms of the storage, you do at least get 128 gigs on all three of these smartphones, although you do have different SKUs of storage available in different regions. And all three support microSD memory cards to expand that storage as well if you want to. So these budget blowers all sport a screen size about the same, but the technology is different. The Poco and the Realme sport an IPS display, whereas the Redmi is an AMOLED panel, and you can notice the difference immediately side by side like this. That AMOLED screen is brighter than the other two when you max them out. It's got poppier colors and the contrast is sharper as well. You've got really properly black blacks. So if you're after a proper bit of eye candy, then definitely the Redmi is the way to go. That said, the IPS panel on the Realme 8 5G and the Poco M4 Pro 5G definitely aren't put to shame. They're pretty strong for IPS panels, especially at this budget price point. Nice wide viewing angles. The colors, you know, certainly on dull and lifeless, they're reasonably punchy. It is a full HD plus resolution on all three as well, 2400 by 1080, so nice crisp detail. All of the usual display settings that you can tinker with are present and correct on all three of these smartphones, including the likes of dark mode. You've got read-in mode / eye comfort mode, which helps to filter blue light in evening times. And you can also play around with the color output here on the MIUI devices and the color temperature at the very least here on the Realme. But of course that AMOLED tech here on the Redmi Note 10S does come at a price, and that price is the refresh rate. You've got 90Hz support here on the Poco and the Realme smartphones with their IPS panels, but because it costs more to have a higher refresh on an AMOLED panel, unfortunately the Redmi does top off at 60Hz. As for the built-in speakers, well, it's actually a stereo speaker output here on the Poco M4 Pro and the Redmi Note 10S, although admittedly that top speaker is a bit tinny on both, so it's not a true stereo speaker effect. But pretty good for this budget price point. Meanwhile, on the Realme 8 5G, it is just a mono speaker down below, easily muffled, unfortunately, but the output's all right. And you've got respectable wireless audio support as well. Bluetooth 5.1 on the Poco and Realme smartphones. It's only Bluetooth 5.0 on the Redmi, but I found that all three absolutely fine for streaming to Bluetooth speakers and headphones. Nice and dependable and a decent range. So now, performance, and all three of these budget handsets are actually powered by a MediaTek chipset. So you've got the MediaTek Dimensity 810 fresh 6nm chipset here on the Poco M4 Pro 5G. In the case of the Redmi, it's a Helio G95, and on the Realme, it is the older MediaTek Dimensity 700. Now I've actually got the 6 gig model of the Poco and the Redmi. It's the 8 gig model of the Realme 8 5G, so that helped to bump up the score somewhat. And having used all three as my full-time smartphone, I can see that everyday shenanigans are absolutely fine on all three. You can run plenty of apps at the same time, and gamers will be happy with just, you know, your basic Call of Duty, PubG style titles. Don't expect to be playing Genshin Impact on a playable frame rate on any of these blowers, but certainly, you know, your online shoot 'em up efforts run absolutely fine, respectable frame rate on the sort of medium detail settings. You've got a responsive screen on all three as well, so no worries there. And yes, you do have that dedicated gaming mode on all three of these budget blowers as well, which can just help to limit distractions by blocking notifications. You can take screenshots and actually record the action mid-game, clear up the memory with just a tap, all that sort of stuff. However, one problem with the Helio chipset used by the Redmi Note 10S is the fact that it doesn't have a built-in 5G modem, unlike the chipsets that are used by the Poco M4 Pro 5G and the Realme 8 5G. The clue's kind of in the name. So if you do want that future-proof connectivity, you'll have to choose between the others. As for the battery life, well, I'm happy with all three of these budget-friendly handsets because they all pack a 5000 mAh capacity battery, and that'll keep you going all day long unless you really punish these things. You can generally get a lot of screen on time, plenty of mixed use, lots of audio streaming in the background while you're messaging, messing around, and doing a good bit of camera shenanigans as well, all that good stuff. However, while the Poco and the Redmi smartphones support 33-watt charging, so you'll get filled back up again reasonably nippily, the Realme 8 5G tops off at 18 watts, so it is noticeably slower. And let's finish up this best budget smartphone comparison with a squint at the camera tech, and all three offer different sensors. The Poco, you got a 50 megapixel primary sensor, the Redmi has a 64 megapixel primary sensor, and on the Realme it's a 48 megapixel primary sensor. Now, if you jump on into the camera apps on these three phones, it's a very similar experience on all three. It's pretty much identical, of course, on the Poco and the Xiaomi, as they both use the standard MIUI camera app. But even the Realme one, very similar indeed. They've all got an AI mode, which you can quickly activate with a quick tap of the toggle up there. This can just tweak the settings for your photo automatically on your behalf to suit whatever you're trying to shoot, be it in this case the gorgeous Veronica, of course. I tend to leave that knocked off though in general, because it does tend to boost the colors a little bit on occasion and make everything look a bit artificial. Of the three of these budget blowers, the Realme tends to oversaturate images more than its rivals when conditions are a bit tricky. It also pumps out the most artificial looking colours when you're shooting in daylight, but if you prefer punchier visuals, you might actually get on with it. Move indoors and the Redmi starts to struggle a bit with colour accuracy compared with the other two here, and the Redmi also feels in low light with serious grain even when the night mode is employed. In contrast, the Poco really brightens up a scene, while the Realme captures something closer to what you'll see with the naked eye. You've also, of course, got the same bonus modes on all three basically as well, including a portrait mode, which you can swap to like so, and that just adds a nice bokeh style effect behind your subject. Lots of other bonus modes as well, which you can have a bit of a tinker and a play with. And when you do get more on the Xiaomi and the Poco smartphones, I found that the best stuff is still found here on the Realme. You've still got a slow-mo mode, you've still got a Pro Expert mode, and you can use this to mess around with the ISO level, shutter speeds, all that kind of shenanigans if you need a very specific kind of shot. However, while both the Poco M4 Pro 5G and the Redmi Note 10S both have an ultra-wide angle shooter, in both of these phones it's an 8 megapixel sensor, you don't actually get an ultra-wide angle shooter here on the Realme 8 5G. Instead, the Realme just has your bog standard boring mono and macro sensors. You also get macro and depth sensors here on the Redmi smartphone, whereas the Poco literally has the primary sensor and that ultra-wide angle shooter, and that is it. No bullshit macro or depth sensors or other pointless shenanigans. As for video, well, it's very basic on the Poco and the Realme, which can only shoot full HD resolution footage at 30 or 60 frames per second, whereas in the case of the Redmi, you can bump that right up to 4K res footage at 30 FPS, so more detail, nicer looking video. All three are perfectly fine for your everyday home movie shenanigans. You've got decent image stabilization on all three. As long as you drop down at that full HD resolution on the Redmi at 4K Ultra HD level, things get a bit shaky. And the Redmi is actually the more basic of the trio when it comes to the selfie shooter, with a 13 megapixel snapper compared with the 16 megapixel efforts on the Poco and the Realme. All the same, all three are absolutely fine for your basic shareable shots. They'll do the job. In low light, it is again the Poco that produces the brightest, nicest looking shots, but all three do a job with decent lighting, although the Redmi does tend to blow out the background with the portrait mode active. So that right there in a nutshell is how the Poco M4 Pro 5G stacks up against the excellent Redmi Note 10S and the Realme 8 5G. So which one of these budget blowers are you most tempted by? It'd be great to hear your thoughts down in the comments below. And for more on the latest and greatest tech, including unboxings and reviews with the latest budget blowers, please do poke subscribe and ding that notifications bell. Have yourselves a fantastic rest of the week. Cheers everyone, love you.